I'll get started. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invite. Uh, I well, what I did in my presentation is just to give you an idea of what I do in my lab, and as a faculty, what kind of, in addition to teaching is just one part of the job, but what kind of things that I do in my lab with my students. It's just for me to give you an idea, and I'll open it up for questions at the end. And you can ask me any question related to college or my work or how to be successful in college. So my name is Solomon Adera, and I am a faculty at the University of Michigan in mechanical engineering. So my training was in engineering. Okay, so my career path is I am from the DC, Maryland area, so I grew up there, and I started college by first going to community college. From then, I transferred to Georgia Tech, and then finally I went to MIT. That's where I got my degrees, and I did my master's, PhD in mechanical engineering. And now I'm teaching at the University of Michigan. So what's engineering? Well, there are many kinds of engineering. Some of you have mentioned that you want to be mechanical engineering or electrical computer science engineering. In all this engineering, I think one important skill that will help you do very well in engineering courses is you have to be very good in science and math. Those are like the basics. And by science, I mean you're going to use a lot of physics. The physics classes that you take in high school, you see them being useful when you take your college courses. And probably some of you might be taking AP calculus. Those are like tools that are very essential to be successful in college. And in terms of the engineering, broadly speaking, there are the major types of engineering are mechanical engineering, which I will talk a little more in the next few slides, civil engineering, chemical, and electrical. Computer science comes with, it's close to electrical engineering as well. And but generally, whichever engineering you choose as a career path, as I said, science and math are important. Importantly, you use those skills to solve or create or make new materials. So as an engineer, your main task is solving challenges that the industry faces. And I'll show that by showing you some of the examples that I do in my lab. So, and of all the engineering, actually, of all the engineering that I listed here, the one that's very broad is mechanical engineering. And that's who I am. I'm a mechanical engineer. So what do mechanical engineers do? These are just few examples that you can do as a mechanical engineer. You might have seen a walking robot. That's the typical task of a mechanical engineer. Cell phones, they're designed and made by mechanical engineers. There's a lot of things that that I do with cell phones in my lab, which I'll show soon. And the big TV screens and displays, the jumbo TV displays that you see in a stadium, they're made by mechanical engineers. Anything that's moving, like cars or tractors, all the component parts are designed and fabricated by mechanical engineers. And to do all these tasks, you always need your math and physics skills. You have to be very good with these kinds of things. And you can imagine by making a small error when you design, for example, a car, you can, you as an engineer, you're responsible to make sure that the things that you design do what they're supposed to do. So safety is an important factor. And here the merry-go-round and the Six Flags, the Ferris wheel, they're designed by mechanical engineers. And I mentioned earlier that everything that's moving, like cruise ships, airplanes, and these spacecraft, they're all made by mechanical engineers. And for example, if you look at a car, it does have many technical parts. There are a lot of components that have to work synchronously for efficient performance. Uh, uh, so my journey to become an engineer is actually when I was a little kid, I used to break things apart and put them together using Legos. And at an early age, I was obsessed by like putting these things together, making something that's useful. That was my experience. And I guess I was playing with Legos. I was making stuff, but importantly, my inspiration comes from my dad. My dad, he didn't have an opportunity to go to college. Both my mom and my dad, I'm the first generation to go to college. They didn't go to college, but they always emphasized the importance of education when I was a little kid, and therefore I was always that was my motivation for me behind working hard in high school and getting the good grades. And therefore they put the importance of education in my growing up. They emphasized the importance of education, and that was my inspiration in college. So my path is here. Like I went to Georgia Tech first. I got my degree in mechanical engineering. And when I go to grad school, I went to MIT, which is shown here. I got my master's and PhD in mechanical engineering. Doing master's and PhD in, well, typically when you go to college for bachelor's, you typically take a bunch of classes, a number of classes every semester, and you do well getting A's and B's to graduate. But graduating with a PhD is a different, it's not just taking classes. As I said earlier, in engineering, you solve problems. And therefore, when you're doing your PhD, typically it takes about 5 to 6 years, and you're tasked to solve an engineering problem. And so you can imagine how long the journey is. For the 5 or 6 years, you work on a specific problem, and you will graduate when you solve the problem. So in terms of research, the research work that I do in my lab, as I said earlier, I'm a mechanical engineer, and mechanical engineer is so broad and wide. Some of the things that I do in my lab is if you look at your laptops, or if you look at your cell phones, when they're operating, they generate heat. You might have experienced a case where when you use your cell phone for a long time, it gets hot, and it starts creating problem. And if you don't stop using it, it's gonna get hot, and it will damage some parts. And therefore, in my lab, we devise ways where we can dissipate the heat efficiently so that you can use your cell phone for a longer duration. We also create surfaces, which are shown here. We create, for example, this is a plant where water droplets actually don't stick on the surface. These are called lotus leaf inspired. They're inspired by a lotus leaf, which doesn't allow water droplets to stick. During rainy season, or when water droplets come in contact, they fall off readily. And by taking inspiration from nature, by studying these plants, we create surfaces that repel water. And for that work, we look at how water droplets interact with the surface. This image shows you a water droplet sitting on an aluminum surface. And we study the interaction between the water droplets and the surface to be able, eventually, the eventual goal being creating a surface that does not get wet with water. And these are some of our work where we look at how droplets interact with one another on these surfaces. These surfaces which repel water, we call them hydrophobic surfaces. So in my lab, we create hydrophobic surfaces. We study the interaction of the water droplets with the surface with the intent of creating a water repellent material. And this is a device that you have in in telecommunication. The signal that goes from one tower to another tower, they have high electron mobility transistors. This is a typical high electron mobility transistor where the heat is generated in a very small area. As you can see here, the hot 4 sections that you see there is where the heat is generated. And unless we remove this heat efficiently from the device, it stops operating, and it could also be damaged by the heat that's generated in the device. And as part of the interaction between droplets and a surface, we also look at how, like, generally solid materials interact with a fluid. In this case, these Cheerios, when you put them in milk, how many of you know what Cheerios effect is? Does anybody know? No? Yes? So Cheerios effect is when you put the Cheerios in a milk. You can do this experiment in your own house later. If you put Cheerios on a milk, they usually aggregate towards the end. They don't want to sit at the center. If you look at these ones, the Cheerios travel to the end and aggregate towards the periphery. And this actually is, we studied this, and this is determined by the interaction of the solid with the milk, in this case, with the fluid, in this case, the milk. And a little more about the thermal management. Thermal management typically means how do we efficiently remove the heat that's generated in a device so that it can continue to work at optimal efficiency. And heat transfer actually is a very common problem in a lot of applications. For example, when you're driving interstate, you might get stuck when the radiator cannot cool the engine efficiently. You can have a scenario where you would be stranded on a roadside because the heat that's generated inside the engine is not removed efficiently. I blurred the logo of this cell phone on purpose, but these cell phones, as I said earlier, it generates heat, and unless we efficiently remove the device, the heat from the device, the heat can damage the cell phone as shown here. And the same problem actually exists in laptops. This is the inside of a laptop. And if you look at the outside, there is non-uniform heat distribution. The red ones indicate higher temperatures. And unless this heat is removed again, it will have the fate of the cell phone where it will be damaged. Or the worst scenario is catching fire like this, but it starts by slowing down your processes. Like whatever you're doing on your laptop, it starts to slow down with the eventually damaging the device. And this is another example. Solar cells, they're used to generate electricity. That's one way of, a cleaner way of generating electricity is by using solar radiation. These are solar farms. These are solar panels. And they, by collecting the solar radiation and converting it to electricity, while doing so, there is a lot of heat that's generated in the solar panels. And if you touch them with your hands, they're very hot. And there has to be a very efficient cooling so that it continues to operate, so that it continues to generate electricity. So That's just the thermal management aspect of my work, where I guess what we do is we first study how these materials generate heat when they operate, and we measure the amount of it that's generated, and we appropriately design a system where we can remove the heat. The other part, of my work in my lab is creating these super hydrophobic surfaces. And super hydrophobic surfaces are surfaces that does not allow water to spread. As you can see here, this is a lotus leaf. If you put water on these leaves, they beat up, they remain as droplets. They do not spread and wet the surface. This has a lot of applications. These are like, for example, when you're driving, the windshield glass, you want the windshield glass to be a super hydrophobic. That way, when you're driving on a rainy day, you have these water droplets just shedding, uh, uh, the readily sliding down the windshield glass so that it doesn't affect your vision. And using such inspiration, taking the inspiration from plants, typically naturally designed materials, they are optimized through an evolutionary process. Evolution is a very slow process, but through many years of evolution, they have the optimum material characteristic that would help you mimic. So we study this. We study how the droplets interact with the lotus leaf, and we create surfaces that shed these droplets readily. And one good application would be a raincoat. Another application is just what I mentioned about the windshield. When you're making a raincoat, you want the fibers to not be wet. You want the fibers to not be wetted by the water, and as shown here with this figure, with this image. And you also want the water droplets to not spread and wet on your deck. For example, this is a water resistant deck where it could have longer life because it doesn't allow water to seep through the wooden floor. And this is a petal leaf. So the difference between the first two is that the first one is a lotus leaf inspired. That does not allow water to stick on the surface. And so if you just shake it, all the water droplets will leave. These are petal leaves. Petal leaves have a different characteristics. You have water droplets forming, but they have a very strong pinning on the surface. They have a larger friction between the droplets and the leaves. And in my lab, after creating these surfaces, there are different ways of creating these surfaces. We create the surfaces and we put these water droplets on the surface. We see how they behave, how they beat up. And importantly, we measure the friction between the water droplets and the solid surface. And another part that I work in my lab is electricity generation. I have shown earlier that we use solar panels to generate electricity, but the traditional way of generating electricity is using the steam cycle. Steam cycle is a process where you have water and you cycle it between the liquid and the vapor phase to generate electricity. How does that work? It does have four components. You have the water here. It's pumped into a boiler, and inside the boiler, the water boils. So basically, from the liquid water, we generate pressurized steam. It's vapor and also pressurized at high temperature. And that high pressure and high temperature vapor go through a turbine. The turbine, what it does is the energy in the steam will be converted into electricity inside the turbine. So the electricity that's generated using the magnet and the turbine is shipped to the residential area, to the city, wherever you want it. You transport the electricity that's generated from the turbine. Now that the water, so basically what we're doing is the high pressure and high temperature steam, after generating the electricity, it's not high pressure and high temperature anymore. It actually is converted into partial liquid and partial vapor. That vapor liquid mix goes through a condenser, and what we do in the condenser is we flow cold water to allow the remaining vapor to become liquid. And that process is indicated here. A cold water comes in, and the vapor that came out of the turbine changes phase into a liquid. Now all the vapor in the liquid, everything is in liquid form, and that goes to the pump, and then it's pumped back into the boiler again, and this cycle continues. And therefore, theoretically speaking, you use the same amount of water by changing it into vapor and liquid, you continuously generate electricity. And the electricity that we're generating actually comes from the fuel that we're burning inside the boiler. If you remember what I said, with the liquid, after it's pumped to the boiler, we supply energy by burning fuel. The fuel converts the liquid into vapor, and that cycles inside, like goes to the turbine and comes back to the boiler. It operates in a cyclic manner. That's why it's called the steam cycle. But the majority of the energy comes from the fuel that we're burning inside the boiler. And most of these fuels, they're fossil fuels. We use fossil fuels to boil the water. And as you might be aware of, these fossil fuels, they generate a lot of carbon dioxide. Therefore, the carbon dioxide that we're generating and that we're releasing into the ambient comes through the boiler. And that actually has a global warming effect, where it's steadily but eventually increasing the global temperature that makes the earth inhabitable. And therefore, what we do in our lab is we create surfaces that can increase the overall efficiency of the steam cycle. Just to give you an idea, the overall efficiency of the steam cycle is only about 35%. What that means is, if you're using 100 megawatts of fuel, that's if you burn the fossil fuels, which has 100 megawatts of energy, you're generating only 35 megawatts. And so what we do is we try to make this process efficient by creating some of the surfaces that I said that are inspired from nature. One strategy, just to give you an idea, one strategy to do that one is during the condenser, we create surfaces that allow droplets to shed easily. That will improve the heat transfer and the overall efficiency of this steam cycle, so making the electricity generation more efficient. So in my daily task as a professor, I teach one class a semester. So my classes this semester, for example, I'm teaching heat transfer, something related to my work, and I teach twice a week, each class about an hour and a half. So in terms of teaching, I spend 3 hours per week on teaching. But the majority of my time is spent, these are my graduate students here. Each student works on a different project. If you remember what I said earlier, when you're doing your PhD, you solve a problem. So each of these students that you see here, my students, they have their own project. Some of them, for example, one of them is measuring the friction between a water droplet and the surface. So to do that, he makes his own surfaces, he fabricates the surfaces, and he chemically functionalize it and measures the friction between the droplet and the surface. In an F, basically what he does is he measures the friction, and uh, he tries to create a surface that reduces that friction so that water droplets become more mobile. Another one is, for example, with the thermal management, we want to remove the heat from the device footprint more efficiently. So what we do is we create our own, we create the components inside your cell phone, we make them in our own lab, and we generate heat to mimic a cell phone, and we generate how much heat we can dissipate from the surfaces. We measure the heat, and quantify we quantify the heat that's generated, and we quantify how much of the heat we can transport using different strategies. And therefore, all the students, they have their own project. And so I advise my students, I meet with them regularly. Doing PhD, it's a long process. It takes 5 to 6 years. So you can imagine that they encounter problems when they do these experiments. And therefore, my lab is across, like down the hall. When they run experiments, when they have difficulties, they knock on my door. We have discussion. I have more experience than them, and therefore I might suggest ways to approach the problem and to get some hopes that they experience in their work. Like advising them is the majority of my time is spent advising them, and the last component of my work is that all the calculus classes that you're taught in class, all the physics, Newton's laws, action and reaction, all these things that you learn in class, they're well validated, they're true, but through many years of work, a lot of researchers have validated that those things are true. So everything that's found in textbook pretty much is well validated fact. But as a researcher, as a professor in a university, you're pushing the boundaries of science. We're trying to create new materials, new surfaces, new methods, and therefore we're always pushing the boundaries of science. So what gets me excited, and what's exciting for a researcher, is to discover something new. And that requires a lot of thinking, a lot of reading materials related to your work. So I say that to say these things that we're doing in the lab, eventually they will solve a problem. They will result in something new. So you discover something new that has never been discovered, that was not discovered before. So how do you communicate that? As a university professor, when we get to that level, it takes many experiments, a tremendous amount of work, but eventually when you get the results, you publish those results in a journal. So journal publications are ways for scientists to communicate their new results. So those results, they accumulate over many years, and eventually they will become books. And therefore, if you put how I spend my time, very small fraction of my time is spent teaching students in a classroom. Currently, as I said, I teach heat transfer, and I have 95 students. I meet with them 3 hours a week. And outside of that, my door is always open to my students, and we work on different projects, always trying to push the boundaries of science. And then when we get new results, we publish our work in a scientific journal. That will be new knowledge. Like you have to have a new understanding or new knowledge for you to publish in a scientific journal. And the advantages and disadvantages of I think actually recently someone asked me why how I chose to be a professor. That actually is a very good question. So the as I said, when like what gets me excited in my work is whenever we got something new. So basically, all the time you're working on the forefront of science. Like it's a very specific field, but I know very well about that very specific area, and that leads to new understanding and new results. And in terms of what you can do is in the main difference between like when you're doing your bachelor's, you go to an engineering college, you go to Harvard or any other college, and you're taught what you need to know as an undergraduate student. Therefore, they give you the teaching is structured in such a way that you have a very good understanding of the fundamentals, the processes. So you learn the skill, you learn what you need to uh, they teach you the basics, and they test you on like how much you understand, and based on that you get an A or a B. So I think I say that to say when you're an undergraduate student, it's well structured, you're taught about well established science, and based on that you get your grades. But when you go to graduate school, it's not just necessarily learning in classrooms, but you do your own research. So the difference between an undergraduate education and a graduate education is that in an undergraduate education, you learn the well-developed science, but in graduate school, you produce knowledge. You do something new and you expand the boundaries of science. And therefore, from that perspective, being a professor will give you the leverage to work on different projects. And so the main advantage of being a faculty is that you can work on projects that are interesting to me. There is not necessarily someone to tell you have to do this and that, but you have the liberty of choosing what problems are interesting to you, and you work on those problems. You seek funding, you got the money to do those works, you apply to different agencies to get the money, and that way you support your students and do the work. So the advantage is having the academic freedom to be able to do things on your own time. The I wouldn't call it disadvantage, but one thing that could happen in research is that it might consume all your time. So for me, for example, about all my students are working on different projects. Working on a project, they always face some hurdles and problems in their work. So I'm constantly thinking about those problems, even when I'm even when I'm not in my office. I always think how I can help my students, how we can solve those problems and move to the next one. So from that perspective, you're always engaged. It's barely it could become very difficult to make time for your own, like to make time for something other than work. Uh, so one actually at one Thanksgiving, a family of mine, she said, "Oh, you're lucky. You have like you know there is nobody to see if you're in your office or not," and that's partly true. Nobody checks if I'm in my office, if I do my work, or I don't clock in or clock out in my work. But chances are I work more hours than just a regular person. So it's on your own will, but the driving motivation is that you're at the cusp of discovering something that actually creates some suspense that keeps you going. For me personally, the reason that I chose to be a professor is when I wake up in the morning, there are like 10 things in my head, and I plan how to solve those problems. I came to my office, I work with my students. We might, out of those 10 things, we might make progress on one of them. Remember, these things, they're not overnight projects. They take 4 to 5 years, even 6 years. But you make these small and steady progresses, and at the end, the results are very rewarding. You got to publish your work in a scientific journal. You got the credit when people reference your work, they give you credit for it, and therefore those are the rewarding aspects of the job. Uh, and uh, and so I think, in summary, I was like you at some point when I was your age. So from my experience, what I would like to tell you is, don't let anybody to tell you that you can't be this or that. As long as you work for it, you put the resources and the time. If you work diligently, you can be whoever you want to be. And always chase your dream. I will tell you that I'm a mechanical engineer because I wanted to be a mechanical engineer at a very young age. Actually, it started because when I was 4 or 5 years old, my dad, who never went to college, his bosses were mechanical engineers, and he always tell me, like, as a child, he always wanted me to be one of those people, and he motivated me, he inspired me. And so at a very young age, I wanted to be a mechanical engineer. And when I was your age, a lot of people, because I was doing very well in high school, a lot of my teachers, they used to tell me to go to medical school to make more money, or like I was very good in biology as well. They used to tell me, oh, you have to be a medical doctor. But that never crossed my head. I was always interested in engineering, and I chased my dream, and I'm living the life I really wanted when I was a little kid. And therefore, the sky is the limit. If you chase your dream, if you work hard for it, you can be whoever you want to be. And the key is the classes that you take, the science, the physics, the chemistry, the calculus classes that you take. uh, you might not know how useful they are at this age because you don't use them yet. But when you're at my level, when you start solving problems, when you start pushing the boundaries of science, the little things that are taught in class, the integration, the calculus that are taught in class, they're going to be very handy. So by paying attention now and acquiring the knowledge, you'll be well equipped to solve those engineering problems in the future. And with that, I would. So this is one of the images that my student got from his experiment. In this work, we actually are studying how water droplets freeze on a surface. The application being in like being in the Northeast, in being in New York, you might have experienced it of during the snowy season, toppled roofs. You might have experienced delays in flights because of icing. And one of the things that we do in our lab is we study how this frost forms on the surface, and we're creating a surface that does not allow ice to form. And with that, I would like to open it up for questions, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have regarding college or education in general.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Like I learned so much about like mechanical engineering and the projects you were doing. And so like one question I have is What was your like favorite project that you worked on like in all your experience? Like this can be with like a student or just like maybe in grad school.
Uh, so uh, I would okay. I will answer that this way. So if you ask your parents who is your favorite child, they will never tell you. So for me, all my projects are equally important. And actually, the one that you love the most is the one that's at the cusp of getting the results. Like usually, as I said, we work like for 5 6 years, and the end is going to be we solve the problem, we discover something new, and we publish it in a journal. And so always the one that's dear to my heart is the one that I'm about to publish, that's going to come out. And therefore, to that end, this work, the image that I just showed you, this surface that does not allow ice to form, it just got accepted to the proceedings of the National Academy of Science. We just got accepted. The work was published. It's a long process. So the work was published 6 months ago, and we finally received last week that they approved the work. So it's going to come out next week. So that's now dear to me. But once that's published next week, we're on to the next project. So that's how it goes. And just to give you an idea as well, this works when you work for 4 5 6 years, you publish this work, you submit them to a journal. These are scientific journals. These after you submit them, there do you guys know, have heard about peer review? So my work, the one that I submitted 6 months ago, it was sent. I don't know who the reviewers are, but they will send them to people who work on the similar area. So the work is sent to them. Those people review it, and then they ask additional question or things of that nature. They might say, "Oh, you can't say this. You have to make correction or do this or that," or they will ask you to do additional experiments, and you do those, and it finally will be published. For this work, we submitted it 6 months ago, and we got the review 3 months ago. They asked us to do additional experiments to make sure that the claim works, because on this one we're claiming that we're creating an ice repellent surface, and therefore they asked us additional question. We responded to those, and then they finally agreed, and we're publishing it very soon.
Oh, we have a few people that have raised their hands, so I'll just go with Freya first.
So I was just wondering if there were any like internship opportunities at the University of Michigan for high school students, if they were interested in this topic.
Yes, we do. Actually, send me an email and I can contact you. And I myself will look for. If you go through my research website, actually, I had high school last summer. I had one high school student, and the summer before then, I also had a summer's high school students. And therefore, reach out to me. I'd be happy to connect you.
Thank you.
My question was like you talked about like steam power. So like you said, I believe you said the efficiency was like 30 to 35%.
Yes.
But throughout your research, what do you think, like how much will it be increase, the percentage?
That's a very, very, very good question. So steam cycles, their efficiency about 35%. That means if you burn 100 megawatt, you're going to get 35 megawatt. That's true. And globally, it's not just in the United States. Globally, 90% of the electricity is generated using the steam cycle. So you can imagine how humongous the industry is. Like if you look at medium-sized power plant, they if the efficiency being 35%, if you can improve the efficiency even by a very small margin, if you can make it, let's say 40%, the saving that you have is going to be humongous given the scale, like globally. And therefore, it's good to make it like, if you can make it like very high efficiency, that's good, but small improvements will have significant impact in terms of the carbon dioxide that's released into the environment. Therefore, that's one factor. And so to make a very big, I think my point is, to make a very big impact, a small improvement will have significant effect. And in my work, what we're doing is we're not directly measuring, we're not generating the electricity from the steam power plant. We're improving the efficiency of the condenser. But in terms of improving the efficiency, we're doing very good. We're improving it by more than 100%. Did that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Yes.
So I was just wondering. I'm sorry, there's people here. But I was just wondering. 1 second. I just have to tell. Okay. Is there any type of like characteristic or value that someone who goes into mechanical engineering needs to have? Like, if they don't have that value, that they will not succeed.
Well, I'm an engineer, so I can tell you as an engineer, and I'm a mechanical engineer as well. So the only, I think, the one, if you really want to be an engineer or mechanical engineer or whatnot, if you put the work in it, you can always be one. That's one. And the second thing is, but to be more, like to be a very good mechanical engineer, you really need to be very good in the calculus classes that you're taking, and the physics and chemistry. These are probably the three most important classes you need. The physics, like Newton's law that they teach in class, Newton's action and reaction, force is equal to mass times acceleration. Those are like the very fundamental one. They will teach you more in college, more complicated ones. But you have the basics in high school. Those are the things that you need as a mechanical engineer. But a very strong foundation in math would make your life much, much easier. Like the time that you spend studying calculus now, when you go to college, you're going to learn more calculus classes. But having those skills and like having a very good background in math, it will be, your college classes will be easier, I would say. Like having those strong foundation now, the college classes that you're going to take will be much easier. Most engineering classes that you're taking, they require a very strong foundation in math. And if you have that, I think your life will be much, much easier. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
I know you said that you interview students for the university. So, what is something that really makes a candidate stand out to you?
That's excellent question. Well, typically in high school, it's good to take AP classes. That will be very useful. It will make your application stronger. But most importantly, in college applications generally, what colleges are looking for is, so let's say you apply to Harvard or MIT. They want to know what you can bring to the school. And that could be, most of the time, that's reflected in leadership, like in volunteering, doing outside of the schoolwork. So taking AP classes, that will be like the academic aspect when you're evaluated. But you guys being involved, especially in leadership, like what you're doing, organizing these events and stuff, it shows that you value like the community. You're putting effort, resources, and your time to help others. So that will reflect very highly of you when you apply for colleges. So typically when I interview students, that's what I always look for in their statement. And in my interaction, one-on-one interview, I usually ask them, what did you do outside of school? And those skills are easy to overlook, but being in college now, being an insider, those are the qualities that will make your application very strong. Getting the AP classes, getting the SAT score, those are good, but those are only one aspect of your evaluation. So colleges, they will look for, what are you bringing to the school? What are your unique qualities as an individual, so that the school would be fighting to get you. So put these things on your resume. Those are good.
Thank
And
you.
the last thing, if I think somebody was asking me, if you have an opportunity, yes, I think it was Shreya, if you have an opportunity, reach out to faculties and get involved in some kind of research. So this research, for example, if someone comes to my lab with your background in high school, it's very hard to get engaged in research. The reason being, you remember what I told you, in college, in high school, we teach you well-established science. 2 plus 2 is 4. There is no any other answer. There is no any other way to answer that one. So these are like well-established facts that we teach you in class. But when you do research, there are a lot of unknowns. There is gray area. The end result is to discover something and make it push the boundaries. And for that, it requires a different skill set. I usually tell my students, like, you go to the gym, you work out, you develop muscles. You can't do that in an overnight. It's a long process, but every day you're making steady and consistent progress. So the mental, the way of thinking, the mental activity that you need in research is different from just sitting in a classroom and understanding what the teacher teaches you. And therefore, for you guys in high school, you have to reach out to faculty and ask requests to be involved in research. So with the high school students that come to my lab, they work with me, but importantly, I paired them with an experienced graduate student. So they give you mini projects. You solve one problem, you go to the next, and then you finish that in 2 weeks, you go to the next one. But through the process, they will teach you how to ask the right question, how to approach a problem, and how to get to the end result. So get involved in those and reach out to faculties.
Thank you.
Sure.
I
And
have
if
one.
any of you here, you can reach out to me and I would connect you, or we'll figure out something. So feel free to reach out to me. And to that end, actually, I got a lot of emails. So if in case you do, tell me that you met me in the Saturday scholars, okay? So that I give you priority.
Great. Thank you so much for being here today. I learned so much from all of like your information, like not even just about like your work, but also about like research and like how your experience with being a professor is. So we really appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to reaching out to you sometime.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys for being here. But one last thing that I want to say is, you're young, smart, intelligent people, and you shouldn't limit yourself to anything. All the things that they are teaching you in class, the calculus, the physics classes, try to absorb as much information as you can. you don't know where they're going to be useful. When you go to college, and especially when you start getting involved in research, all the little things, even the Newton's laws, action and reaction, you will see them in practice. You'll use them to solve problems, and therefore learn as much as you can. Take those classes seriously and chase your dream. You can be, the sky is the limit. You can be whoever you want to be. And if there's anything that I can help you with, anything, reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to help.
Thank you
Okay,
so much.
guys. Okay, all right. See,
Thank you.
good luck, guys, with classes, and I'll see you soon.